I can say it is a small things that was thinking that we have different kind of perspective on a topic. It is a very vast kind of things that to talk about, but we have three different kind of perspectives that it was interesting for me, and thank you the speakers. So is there any question? Can you?
I suppose it's an observation that I think is really interesting and was spoken about, across all that you were talking about. And I think it's more how architecture was used as a way to either build value or power. I think in that case it was quite interesting because it was like almost adopting that international style. You called him a socialite, and it was like it was almost like you have to adopt that in order to be accepted in that circle to then have value to go on. And so I think there is kind of what the style is, or how you get included or excluded, and all of those are quite a complex kind of system which is built around values and who decides that value and how that value is generated. Mm. And I thought maybe that would be really interesting to actually ask how, this idea of value and identity might be really interesting.
I can jump right in. In Cairo, as we speak, just this past couple of weeks, a neighborhood, a settlement, an urban settlement that's been there for about 700 years, was bulldozed, completely wiped out. Not the first, won't be the last. This has been an ongoing process, kind of a corrosive process that's been happening, but a lot of it depends on the perception of value being one of the tourist. And not even actually, some tourists are pretty sophisticated who like to stay in charming Airbnbs, I don't know, on some sort of but it's a very specific kind of tourist in mind who has total superior position from the perspective of the Egyptian state, which is not working for the Egyptian people and has not been, never has been. It's imposed, it gets its arms from London and Paris, and it gets its prestige and value from London and Paris, not from the people. So with that context, you can have an entire 700-year-old urban settlement with vernacular urban architecture that's documented in 19th century photography be wiped out as shanties. So again, this whole point of value needs to come from within if we're serious about decolonizing. This is actually how colonization has always worked. It's not necessarily by. I think that most Egyptians still think that they need to see a British soldier in World War II uniform at their doorstep to accept that they are still colonized. Meanwhile, their money is not in their control. Their army is actually pointing their guns inwards, not outwards. That's questionable. And their heritage is being wiped out every single day. So, those three things alone, to me, sound like a pretty colonized situation. So, yeah, value, definitely, where it's produced, totally transforms the landscape. Yeah.
Okay, we have...
Thank you. Thanks to all three speakers. I really very much enjoyed all of your talks. But I have an extremely specific question about Guvrekian, about whom I've written, because I've written about the Villanois. What year did he go to Alabama Polytechnic? Do you know? Because Alabama Polytechnic became Auburn, and it became desegregated in 1963. So I wondered if it was before or after that. So he in 47 he was in the white segregated university, not Tuskegee. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks so much for the really interesting presentations. Apologies, I was a bit late. I was just reflecting on some of the similar themes, and I felt that there was something about aspiration in terms of the nation-state aspiration for modernity, for universalization and the kind of perhaps the Western canon, as well as the aspiration of the personal and the identity and knowledge-seeking and professionalization, and whether there's perhaps, I don't know, speaking anecdotally, a kind of personal pride about immigrant kind of education and coming back home and seeking this this pride in some of these subjects. And I wondered whether you could speak a little bit about this relationship of kind of personal, perhaps, aspiration and professional, I don't know, yearning, and the kind of that relationship with the nation state, really. Thanks.
I can talk about it a little bit from a non-architectural perspective, but I think it would apply nevertheless, in the sense that I think in the midst of the kind of the values that are projected onto us, especially by coming from Eurocentrism in terms of how you're supposed to be. I remember when I was being brought here as a child, the explanation I was given by my parents was that you will get a better education. So, that was already there. You come here to acquire something, to acquire a certain way of seeing things and values then before going back. But what that ignores is that actually, and it's really interesting that I think individuals are already, even back then and now even more so, are exposed to all sorts of materials coming at them from all sorts of places. So whether they like it or not, whether they're aware of it or not, that those elements, materials, whatever you want to call them, are constantly working at who they are and how they lead their lives. They create, if you like, interesting combinations, sometimes outside their control, which lead them in directions. There's an academic who also talks about modernity, and the notion, the sort of the myth, if you like, that modernity, it comes from the West, yeah. But and so talking about othering and these notions of backwardness and all being primitive and all these elements, he comes up with a very kind of provocative but interesting concept of privileged backwardness. And when I first came across it, I thought, okay, take it easy, take a deep breath. What do you mean by that? But actually what he meant is that in some sense, in this kind of, if you like, coexistence between Eurocentrism and modernity that comes from Europe, and then, in inverted commas, the backwardness of other cultures. What he means by privilege is that there's an element where people who come from those places don't necessarily need to go through the developmental process that those original European countries have gone through in order to gain access to the advantages that brings. In addition to that, they can then interpret and reinterpret those things as well. So that modernity, right, the way he describes it, is the result of a kind of uneven combination of things, which is not temporal and it doesn't grow necessarily in a kind of linear way. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or deviating from it, but I think I just want to sort of reiterate that in some sense, it's important, if possible, to try to shift, especially as an immigrant, right, from adopting either one position or the other of the Eurocentric or the immigrant, my identity, where is it gone, to abandoning myself to these uneven combinations that are there and are functioning and see and work with them. I call it in my work the surplus material, so to speak.
Thank you so much for the three talks. They were absolutely brilliant and really, really kind of inspiring. I might throw a little bit of a provocation into the mix. So that the two architects presented, I couldn't help but think, well, they're architects, aren't they? And they, as architects, we work for systems of power. Mm. So isn't it inevitable that the architects, rather than the more artistic examples that you gave, are the best evidence of marginalizing minorities and sweeping kind of all nuance away? And isn't that the inevitability that comes with kind of high architecture, particularly high modernist architecture?
So with the case of Said Karim, very interestingly, in the late 40s, he published in his own magazine that I showed, he always wrote an editorial. And he did a whole issue on the legacy of the grandfather of the present king at the time as a great builder who needed architects to realize his vision for modernizing Egypt. Essentially, he was trying to embarrass publicly the present king for not hiring him. Since he's already made a name for himself, he's basically saying, well, we need some big authority, power to give me those big projects. Of course, then a coup d'etat, there was 5 years of revolution, which have been completely wiped under the rug, and ended with a coup d'etat in 1952, CIA-backed. And that was his window of opportunity to approach a new powerful leadership with the same argument, who less than 15 years later put him under house arrest for, you know what I mean? So I get completely your point. It's a predicament of architecture. If I would ever have the opportunity to sort of curate a big architecture exhibition, it would be about the question of about the architect, the role of the architect, in which I feel like, why hasn't anybody done this yet? In sort of engaging with that question, because it is impossible to realize your ideas. I mean, a lot of his writings and published ideas before, there's a kind of frustration because you can't materialize them unless somebody's going to pay for them, give you a big plot of land, and let you do your thing. So he sought that. It didn't matter which regime, the royalty or the Western-backed coup d'etat kind of republic. One ignored him and the other one put him under house arrest, and that was the better of others. I mean, others were put under other kinds of arrest or just disappeared or pushed into exile and so on. So it is the the basis of what we're talking about. Yeah, thank you for that.
I mean, this is kind of a topic that's very dear to me, the role of the architect, and it's kind of something I've worked around for 20 years in terms of really thinking about architecture as rather than, you know, a lot of these architects were lobbying, so there was their ring, you know, they were lobbying basically industrialists, they were lobbying politicians in order to bring this style to life. So that's one way of engaging with politics. And there's another, which is what I'm kind of much more interested in, is how do you deploy architectural skills as a way to actually change political systems. And I think that is really, I think that is really interesting because it starts to talk about counterpower. And it starts to talk about that we need to look at finance in a very different way. We need to look at, client service provision relationship. There are very systemic then issues that become really interesting. And actually, there were a lot of women in history that actually were doing some of that, but again, they're not present in this whole discourse or in the conversation. And so, you know, this idea of journeymen from Christianity, or actually the Roman Empire, moving along, creating a style of architecture. It wasn't just this, you know, it was creating these styles of architecture, and it was a way to colonize. It was a way to take territory. And architecture was the establishment of that territorial gain. And it has been used in other, I'm not going to talk about where, but other kind of places that is being used very tactically. Forensic architecture do it quite well in terms of exploring that. But I think that should be part of this conversation as well around colonialism and the role of the architect and the architecture.
Absolutely.
So it's just quite dear to me, so
Yeah.
I had to say something.
No, if I can follow up on that and Sylvia's question as well. In case of Gevrekian, of course, your observation is absolutely correct and provocation, especially when it comes to the means of modernist architecture, which is an state-driven project at large. But of course, within the 15 minutes discussion around an example or a legacy, it was difficult to show how, for example, in case of Gevrekian, he counteracted with the context that he was placed in as he was moving forward. For example, if in France, at the heart of, let's say, the discussion, he was proposing self-built and, social infrastructure. In Middle East, he was trying to kind of revolutionize some sort of, in his word, introverted typologies with the help of the modernist language to much more, let's say, socially oriented projects, namely Villa. type, not as a villa celebrated, luxurious, let's say, form. But at the same time, when he faced almost a dead end during 1936 under Vichy government, so he basically withdrawn himself for 10 years from architecture. So he left to South France. He lived out of subsistence farming, and he started actually fighting in Barcelona within the anarchist group led by Eisenstein, and who was actually his brother-in-law. So in fact, actually 10 years of his project was in the street fighting, and that's perhaps another aspects of, I mean, for the discussion, of course, open for discussion, that we cannot perhaps ask everything from the architect sides of this figure. There are some, let's say, social agents, political agencies that they have that they are not necessarily being fed or feeding their architecture, but it's as important as their skills or their profession. And in some cases, they choose to change gear and basically be active in the other agencies, not necessarily through their architecture skills or through their architecture, but actually through being an agent in the society as a political agent, basically. And I think in many cases, also in case of Said Karim, it's quite obvious, although my knowledge is quite limited, that his political, let's say, architecture was not necessarily through designing a political project. Or through a specific application of principles of architecture into public or private, let's say, form. So, and that's why perhaps there could be a discussion here about if you're asking too much from the profession or not. So, and any profession, not necessarily architecture.
However, not all professions were founded alongside military, for example. Exactly. Architecture was in many places. Yeah. I mean, in Egypt, it becomes professionalized because the military needs to have its own men to build its buildings, who then later need to build the hospitals, to treat the soldiers, who then need to build the roads, to connect it. And then, so I think people have always been building. The profession of architecture is pretty new, and it seems that it's kind of failing a lot of people. So it's not too late to question that. I mean, this comes to the root of, the relationship of the profession to power. I mean, people have been always built. Those 700-year-old houses were cubic, flat-roofed, very simple facades. To the eye of whoever military general today in Egypt who looked at the map and said, "Oh, those are informal housing," clueless. That's because they don't have the appearance that comes with an architect designed thing, which is tied to power and money. So building outside of the profession becomes just riffraff.
Exactly.
I mean,
can I also say that I come from performance and interdisciplinary performance. I was very much attracted to architecture and working with architects. I found concepts and ideas in architecture that enabled me to kind of develop my ideas. And if you can call them political ideas, but in some ways I would like to say more ideas that challenge the establishment. They're not necessarily within the political realm of much more through and challenging, for example, certain types of architecture within the arts. So, for example, theaters, galleries. These are architectures that are there that are designed to bring people to present something to them, so they sort of see it and they experience it in that way. Museums, as I put in my presentation, for example. Suddenly, through architecture, there are ways of breaking through that and exploring the relationship between the creation of events with the participation of communities, engaging with them, what it is to see and to be seen. All of these ideas, for me, came very much out of architecture and relationship with that. So in a sense, maybe because I'm an outsider to it, but I could see a kind of a radicalism in architecture, in ideas within architecture. It was great. And for the first time, when I worked with students of architecture, I never wanted to work with drama students again. because in the middle of developing ideas, they would suddenly disappear, and there they were in the workshop building things and bringing it back up again. Get a drama student to do that? Never. So.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And I guess based on the time, it's the end of this session. Thank you. So thank you.